The year is 1974. Richard Nixon is in the White House. The Vietnam War is grinding toward its bitter end. And on a remote, jungle-covered island in the Philippines, a 52-year-old man is carefully polishing his rifle. He wears a tattered uniform, more patches than original fabric, that has not been replaced in 3 decades. His boots are held together with vines and sheer determination. His sword, an officer's blade given to him by the Imperial Japanese Army in 1944, is still razor-sharp. This man believes he is still fighting World War II. For 29 years, 6 months, and 8 days, over 10,000 days, Second Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda has been waging his own private war on Lubang Island. He has killed. He has evaded hundreds of searchers. He has watched his comrades die one by one. And he will not surrender. Not until he receives one thing, a direct order from his commanding officer. This is the story of the last Japanese holdout, a soldier whose devotion to duty became a 30-year nightmare, whose refusal to believe the war was over turned him into a ghost, and whose final surrender required the intervention of a retired bookseller who had once been his superior. This is the story of Hiroo Onoda. To understand how a man could fight a war for nearly 3 decades after it ended, we must go back to where it began. Hiroo Onoda was born on March 19, 1922, in the village of Kamikawa, in Japan's Wakayama Prefecture. He was a bright, competitive young man, fiercely driven in kendo and swimming, and by age 18, a traveling salesman driving a 1936 Studebaker through central China. But in 1942, the war came for him. He was conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Army. Onoda was not sent to the front lines. Instead, his intelligence and physical discipline marked him for something far more specialized. He was assigned to the Nakano School, the Imperial Army's elite training facility for intelligence officers and guerrilla warfare specialists. At Nakano, Onoda learned a different kind of soldiering. He was trained in espionage, covert operations, propaganda analysis, and the art of survival behind enemy lines. He learned how to live off the land, how to evade capture, how to wage an invisible war. And he was given a philosophy that would define the rest of his life. An intelligence officer does not die. He survives. He fights. He waits for reinforcements. This was a radical departure from the standard Senjin-kun battlefield code, which demanded that soldiers die rather than be captured. Onoda was taught the opposite, a dangerous distinction that would prove both his salvation and his curse. On December 26, 1944, Second Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda received his final orders. He was to be deployed to Lubang Island in the Philippines, a small, strategically located island approximately 90 miles southwest of Manila. His mission was precise: destroy the island's airstrip, destroy the pier at the harbor, prevent American forces from using Lubang as a staging ground for the inevitable invasion of the Japanese homeland. But there was something else. As Onoda prepared to leave, his commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, gave him a personal directive that would echo through 3 decades of jungle solitude. "You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand," Taniguchi told him. "It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we will come back for you. Until then, hold the island." Onoda accepted those words as sacred. He was 22 years old. Onoda arrived on Lubang in the final weeks of 1944. The island was already garrisoned by Japanese forces, but the situation was deteriorating rapidly. American forces were island hopping across the Pacific, and Japan's defensive perimeter was collapsing. The young lieutenant immediately recognized a problem. His mission required him to destroy the airstrip and harbor. But the senior officers already on Lubang refused to allow it. They needed those facilities to evacuate their own men. Onoda's orders were countermanded. The airstrip remained intact. The pier remained standing. Then, on February 28, 1945, the Americans came. U.S. forces landed on Lubang with overwhelming firepower. Within days, the majority of the Japanese garrison was either dead, captured, or fleeing into the jungle. The island fell. But Onoda did not flee. He did not surrender. He had his orders: hold the island, wage guerrilla warfare, and wait for the Imperial Army's return. He retreated into the mountains with 3 other soldiers who had also refused to surrender. Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, Private First Class Kinshichi Kazuka. 4 men against an island that was no longer theirs. At first, they lived as the Nakano School had trained them. They established hidden camps in the dense jungle, moving frequently to avoid detection. They surveyed the island's military facilities, noting the movements of American and later Philippine forces. They survived on bananas, coconuts, and whatever they could scavenge. The jungle was both their fortress and their prison. The canopy was so thick that sunlight rarely reached the forest floor. The humidity was relentless. The insects were endless. But these men were soldiers of the emperor. They endured. In October 1945, 2 months after Japan formally surrendered aboard the USS Missouri, Onoda's group found a leaflet. It had been left by another Japanese holdout cell, and it contained shocking news. The war had ended on August 15th. "Come down from the mountains." Onoda read the leaflet carefully, then he dismissed it as Allied propaganda. He had been trained to detect deception. The Americans, he reasoned, were simply trying to trick Japanese soldiers into surrendering. The war could not possibly be over. If it were, his commanders would have contacted him directly. More leaflets followed. In late 1945, paper messages were dropped from aircraft bearing the surrender order of General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the legendary Tiger of Malaya, who commanded the 14th Area Army. Onoda studied these with excruciating care. He found what he believed were errors in the text, inconsistencies in the phrasing. To his trained eye, these were hallmarks of forgery. The Americans, he concluded, were getting better at their propaganda. The war continued. The years blurred together. Onoda and his men continued their guerrilla campaign, though their targets gradually shifted from military to civilian. They raided villages for rice, stole fruit from farms, shot cattle for meat which they dried into jerky. Sometimes there were firefights. Onoda's group clashed with Philippine police and soldiers, and in those encounters, men died. By the time Onoda finally surrendered, he and his comrades would be responsible for the deaths of approximately 30 Filipino civilians and security personnel. From Onoda's perspective, these were not murders. They were acts of war. He was still a soldier on a mission. In 1950, the first crack appeared in their small unit. Private Yuichi Akatsu had begun to doubt. Perhaps the war really was over. Perhaps the leaflets were telling the truth. After months of growing suspicion, Akatsu separated from the group in September 1949. 6 months later, in March 1950, he walked out of the jungle and surrendered to Philippine forces. The remaining 3 men regarded Akatsu as a traitor. His desertion only strengthened their resolve. They would not make the same mistake. They would hold, just as Major Taniguchi had ordered. By now, the outside world had largely forgotten about the Japanese holdouts on Lubang. But Onoda's war was far from over. The 1950s brought new attempts to convince Onoda that the war was over. In 1952, letters from the soldiers' families were dropped from aircraft, along with photographs of their loved ones. The letters pleaded with the men to come home. They insisted that the war had ended years ago. Onoda examined each letter meticulously. The handwriting looked genuine. The photographs seemed real, but he had been trained to recognize sophisticated counterfeiting. "These could have been made by prisoners," he told his comrades. "The Americans are forcing our families to write them. We cannot surrender." His fellow soldiers believed him. They stayed. Then came the newspapers. Searchers deliberately scattered Japanese newspapers in the jungle, hoping Onoda would read about the post-war world, about Japan's reconstruction, about the Tokyo trials, about the new constitution that renounced war forever. Onoda read them all, and then he dismissed them as more American trickery. The logic was unassailable to him. If Japan had truly lost, why were American and Philippine forces still hunting him? Why had his commanding officer not come to relieve him? In June 1953, disaster struck. Corporal Shoichi Shimada was shot in the leg during a firefight with local fishermen who had discovered their hideout. Onoda nursed him back to health over many months, using only the primitive medical knowledge he had learned in training. But Shimada's luck would not hold. On May 7, 1954, the two remaining soldiers, Onoda and Shimada, were discovered by a Philippine Army mountain unit training in the jungle. In the shootout that followed, Shimada was killed. Onoda was alone now with just one comrade, Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka. The two men became closer than brothers. They shared the same faith in their mission, the same unshakable belief that Japan would return. The outside world conducted searches. In 1959, the Japanese government officially declared Hiroo Onoda legally dead. They presumed that he and Kozuka had perished in the jungle, victims of disease, starvation, or the occasional firefight. But Onoda was very much alive. He and Kozuka had perfected their survival techniques. They knew every stream, every fruit tree, every cave on Lubang Island. They moved like shadows through the forest, leaving almost no trace. When they needed supplies, they raided at night, stealing rice, shooting cattle, vanishing before anyone could respond. The legend grew among the islanders. A ghost soldier haunted the jungle, a demon in a tattered uniform who could appear and disappear at will. The 1960s brought strange signs. Onoda and Kozuka somehow acquired a transistor radio, though accounts differ on how. They listened to broadcasts from the outside world. They heard about the Tokyo Olympics in 1964, about Japan competing alongside the United States. This did not persuade Onoda that the war was over. Instead, it confirmed his worst suspicions. Japan had been infiltrated. The Americans had turned the homeland into a puppet state. The broadcasts were propaganda designed to break his will. As the Vietnam War escalated, American aircraft flew missions over the region. Onoda heard the jets roaring overhead and felt a grim satisfaction. He had been right all along. The war was not over. The Americans were still fighting in Asia. He did not know, could not know, that the war he was hearing was a different war entirely. Then came October 19, 1972. Onoda and Kozuka were conducting a raid on a village, burning piles of harvested rice. They intended the fires as signals, proof to the Japanese forces they believed were still fighting that they remained loyal to their mission. But local police had been alerted. When Onoda and Kozuka emerged from the shadows, they walked into an ambush. Gunfire erupted. Kozuka was hit. He went down and did not get up. Onoda, now 50 years old, had a choice. He could stay and fight beside his fallen comrade. He could draw his pistol and end his own life as the old code demanded. Or he could run. He ran. He melted into the jungle, alone, the last soldier of the Imperial Japanese Army on Lubang Island. For 18 months after Kozuka's death, Hiroo Onoda fought his war in complete solitude. He built new hideouts, deeper in the jungle than ever before. He continued his surveillance of the island, noting the movements of what he still believed were enemy forces. He survived on bananas, coconuts, and the occasional stolen cow. But something had changed. Kozuka's death had shaken him in ways he would not admit, even to himself. He was the last one. If he died, the mission died with him. Then on February 20th, 1974, a young Japanese man appeared on Lubang Island. His name was Norio Suzuki. He was 24 years old, a university dropout who had grown bored with modern Japan. Before leaving on a global backpacking trip, he had told his friends he was looking for 3 things: Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order. It was a joke, but Suzuki was serious enough to actually search. Suzuki spent 4 days hiking through the Lubang jungle, calling out into the empty forest. On the 4th day, he found what he was looking for. Onoda emerged from the undergrowth, rifle ready, studying the young stranger with the eyes of a man who had been hunted for 30 years. He was suspicious, deeply, profoundly suspicious. But Suzuki did something that no leaflet or loudspeaker had ever done. He spoke to Onoda as an equal. He listened. He did not demand surrender. Over several meetings, the two men talked. Suzuki told Onoda about the world outside, about Japan's economic miracle, about cars and televisions and jet travel. But Onoda remained unconvinced. "I am waiting for orders from my commanding officer," Onoda told Suzuki. "Only Major Taniguchi can relieve me. I will not surrender to anyone else." Most men would have given up. Suzuki did the opposite. Suzuki returned to Japan with photographs proving he had found the legendary holdout. The news caused a sensation. The Japanese government, which had declared Onoda dead 15 years earlier, scrambled to respond. They located Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, the same officer who had given Onoda his orders in 1944. Taniguchi was no longer a soldier. He had become a bookseller, living a quiet civilian life. But when he heard that his former subordinate was still hiding in the Philippine jungle, still waiting for orders, Taniguchi agreed to go. On March 9, 1974, Taniguchi arrived on Lubang Island. He was led deep into the jungle, to a prearranged meeting spot. Onoda approached cautiously. He had inspected his Arisaka Type 99 rifle, still in perfect working condition after 3 decades of meticulous care. He had checked that his 500 rounds of ammunition were dry. He had tied his boots, straightened his tattered uniform, and prepared himself for the possibility that this was a trap. Then he saw him. Major Taniguchi. Older now, white-haired, dressed in civilian clothes, but unmistakably his commanding officer. Taniguchi looked at the ghost before him, gaunt, weathered, still wearing the uniform of an army that no longer existed, and read the orders he had prepared. "In accordance with the Imperial Command, the 14th Area Army has ceased all combat activity," Taniguchi said. "You are relieved of all military duties. Cease military activities and operations immediately." Onoda stood perfectly still. He had waited 3 decades for this moment, and still, part of him expected his commander to whisper, "That was just talk. Here are your real orders." But Taniguchi did not whisper. He folded the paper slowly, deliberately. And for the first time in 29 years, Hiroo Onoda understood. "We really lost the war," he later wrote in his memoir. "How could they have been so sloppy?" Suddenly everything went black. The soldier who had refused to surrender, who had fought a phantom war for 10,000 days, finally laid down his rifle. On March 10, 1974, 2nd Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda formally surrendered to Philippine forces at the radar base on Lubang Island. He carried with him his Arisaka Type 99 rifle, still operable, still deadly, 500 rounds of ammunition, several hand grenades, his officer's sword, and a dagger his mother had given him in 1944, meant for suicide if captured. He had never used it. The surrender made headlines around the world. On March 11th, Onoda was flown to Manila, where he was pardoned by Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos. Despite the 30 people he and his comrades had killed over the years, Marcos recognized that Onoda had genuinely believed he was still at war. When Onoda returned to Japan, a crowd of 8,000 people gathered to welcome him home. He was hailed as a hero, a living symbol of loyalty, perseverance, and the old samurai spirit. But Onoda struggled to adjust to the world he had missed. He had difficulty sleeping in a bed. The noise of modern cities overwhelmed him. The Japan he returned to was not the Japan he had left. It was a prosperous, pacifist democracy, unrecognizable from the militaristic empire of his youth. In 1975, he emigrated to Brazil, where he bought a cattle ranch and tried to build a new life. He married. He taught survival skills to young people. He gradually, painfully, learned to live in peacetime. Hiroo Onoda died on January 16, 2014 at a hospital in Tokyo. He was 91 years old. Until the end, he never fully repudiated his 30-year war. In interviews, he spoke of duty, of shame, of the orders he had been given, and the oath he had sworn. "I don't consider those 30 years a waste of time," he once said. "Without that experience, I wouldn't have my life today." Onoda was not the last Japanese holdout to surrender. That distinction belongs to Private Teruo Nakamura, who emerged from hiding in Indonesia on December 18, 1974, 9 months after Onoda. But Onoda remains the most famous. His story has been told in books, documentaries, and even a novel by legendary filmmaker Werner Herzog. It endures because it asks a question that has no easy answer. How far should a soldier's loyalty go? When does duty become delusion? And what happens to a man who gives everything to a war that ended before he knew it? Second Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda fought for his country for 29 years after his country had stopped fighting. He was not a hero in the conventional sense, nor was he a monster, though he did monstrous things. He was something stranger, a man trapped between an oath and a reality he could not accept. His war ended on a March evening in 1974, when an old bookseller gave him permission to stop fighting. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to WWII Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.